The State We're In report has a comprehensive view of the educational system in Illinois, and we've been doing this every 2 years since 2010. I know as a former superintendent and CEO for CPS, I looked forward to this report every time it was published because it provided both a more global view of what was happening in the state, but also allowed us to compare it to the work that was happening directly in the district. The report aims to provide stakeholders with context around what's happening in Illinois, both from a historical perspective, but also from a national perspective. As a former leader, like I said, this has been a single place to get that information across the state and really just track our progress to see where we're making good progress, but also to shine a light on places where there was definitely more work to do. As a leader in this space, I just want to say that it also highlights the importance of the long-term changes in Illinois student population, which is something we've been tracking for a long time. Especially, that's one challenge, especially when you compare it to the impact of the global pandemic. Our students and their families have weathered tremendous changes, and I would say in some cases more than some of the other states. We've also seen some trends, positive and negative, in testing performance. And in many cases, unfortunately, Illinois falls below some of those national standards, especially as it relates to a issue that I care deeply about, which is affordability of four-year colleges and tuition. The combination of the many different sources that are compiled in this report allow us to paint a clear picture of how our students are faring from early childhood through post-secondary graduation. And it also allows us to think about the challenges that we're facing. And we still do disaggregate data so that we can see how students are doing against different demographics, whether that be race, ethnicity, their English language learner status, disability status, gender, and income, because we know that those factors do matter. Throughout this report, we will highlight those gaps in equity. Because we think they're important to understand in order to solve these problems. And I hope that you will engage with both the report as well as the participants who will be on in the webinar today, and be prepared to ask any questions that you have and engage deeply in the conversation. Next, I'm going to hand it to Kelsey Bakken, the Director of Policy, to walk us through the report and its findings. Kelsey?
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. So I will go ahead and get us started. As Dr. Jackson noted, we will be discussing our biannual State We're In report, which takes a quantitative look at the full scope of inputs, outputs, and outcomes across the full B through 20 educational system. You can see some of our prior reports here. Before we jump into the presentation today, I want to pause and thank the 2025 State We're In Advisory Group. Members include practitioners, researchers, and advocates who lend their expertise to make sure that our report is technically sound and robust. As Dr. Jackson alluded to, we look at a robust set of 80 metrics that allows us to examine the full scope of education, including enrollment and access, learning conditions, and outcomes along the continuum. We make sure to focus on both current performance and longitudinal trends, as well as the national context. We are also utilize disaggregated data to better understand critical equity gaps. There are instances along this report where we will denote where data is not available. And in this report, we will flag where changes at the federal level have resulted in data sets that have been delayed or are in danger. And we will denote that by the symbol there at the bottom. In each of the State We're In reports, we take time to examine how Illinois is progressing on key metrics along the continuum. Having a comparable kindergarten readiness indicator has helped motivate a statewide focus on early childhood education and care. And what we know is that progress on this metric is a strong indicator for future academic performance. Since we started collecting this data, kindergarten readiness has improved from 23% to 31% on all three domains. But we also know that just a third of students exhibit readiness across all developmental domains as they start their K-12 education. So although recent growth is good, the state can and should continue to strengthen this area. Next, we'll look at a few of our K-12 academic progress and persistence metrics. Looking at Illinois NAEP proficiency, or the nation's report card, we see both that Illinois held steadier than other states, but only about a third of students are proficient. Again, we'll explore this more later on in the presentation. There are some bright spots in the K through 12 landscape, with high school persistence and completion both in the high 80s and seeing some equity gaps starting to close in these areas. Importantly, and something that is worth the state investigating more, is that college and career readiness, as measured by the ACT and the SAT, has been dropping since 2015, and that's dropped from 38% of students meeting those benchmarks to 30%. Now, quickly moving on to our higher education enrollment and attainment metrics. One trend that has not recovered since the pandemic is the percentage of students enrolling in higher education immediately following high school graduation. That number was at a high in 2019 and dropped to 66% of students in 2024. And as many of you know and who are following, last week, the Illinois State Board of Education, or ISB, released their 2025 report card with updated metrics. Where we can, we'll highlight some of these data points along the way. Unfortunately, this metric, immediate college enrollment, is one metric that remains stable. And I say unfortunately because right now that number is below those pre-pandemic highs, so something that we're keenly aware of right now. The state set a goal of having 60% of Illinoisans with a post-secondary degree by 2025, and the state has made some tremendous progress in this area, with improvements in both post-secondary completion and attainment metrics. And you can see that about 50% of Illinoisans have a post-secondary degree. A quick note that you can read more about in the report regarding the importance of the Illinois longitudinal data system is right now we're looking at sector-specific data, which allows us to understand how that individual sector is doing. But it's also important that we're able to track students to and through their educational experience in Illinois. So when a student enters ninth grade, are they able to move to and through their to college graduation and beyond? Right now, Illinois does not have a fully functioning Illinois longitudinal data system that allows the public to make sense of that data. So it's something that we're really hoping that the state can continue to implement and work towards. Another important component of the Statewide report is to understand how the state measures up against other states around the country. The information on the left highlights that among a number of metrics in Illinois, Illinois is measuring up in the top half of states. And again, we're going to explore this along the way, but you can see here, 2 out of 5 early childhood metrics are in the top half of states, 10 out of 16 for K through 12, 20 out of 28. So some really important highlights that we're going to go over. Importantly, though, and before I get started on the individual sectors, Illinois has shown real progress in narrowing equity gaps in many areas across the education continuum. However, when doing this analysis, we found that among the metrics with an available state ranking, all but one had equity gaps. And I'm going to repeat that because it's really important. All but one of our over 80 metrics had equity gaps for students from low-income households, students of color, and English learners, or students with disabilities. This highlights the need for a continued focus in those areas. More information on those metrics can be found in the data tables in the report. Now, jumping right into early childhood education and care, we will highlight enrollment and access metrics, learning conditions, and outcomes where applicable. Starting with early childhood, we see that for access, we can see that Illinois is doing well in serving its 3-year-olds in state-funded preschools, but has room for improvement when it comes to our 4-year-olds enrolled in preschools and access to Head Start. Looking at state funding for preschool, Illinois is right in the middle of the pack at 26th, and we'll dig into that in a little bit. Next, looking into our K through 12 metrics, we can see that there are some clear bright spots. Illinois is performing well on some indicators, including per student funding at 18th in the country, student to teacher ratios at 4th in the country, and students taking AP exams at 7th. Important components for creating a robust learning environment for students. There are some areas that will need the state's attention, including chronic absenteeism, which Illinois ranked 20th in the nation, and mental health indicators, where 2 of the 3 metrics Illinois was in the bottom half of states. Last, there's a diverging story being told with our outcome metrics. Illinois ranked 29th and 30th for NAEP reading and math for 4th grade, highlighting a clear area for improvement. Meanwhile, Illinois continues to be in the top half of states for 8th grade proficiency and growth. If you're interested in learning more about NAEP scores and how we measure up, a tableau is available on our website. The state rankings in higher education point to an interesting picture and beg the question of how much talent and opportunity we are leaving on the table. For enrollment and access, Illinois state spending on post-secondary institutions is nearly last in the country, and tuition and fees are some of the highest in the country. Yet the state ranks in the top 20 of states for net tuition, suggesting to us that state financial aid and institutional scholarships and assistance are helping combat rising cost. How the state ranks in learning conditions and outcomes point to strong performances by our institutions. We're fifth in the nation for community college retention and top half of states for measures of both completion and attainment. Institutions are able to move students through their post-secondary experience, but it begs the question of what are we losing when enrollment and access are some of our lower state rankings and affordability is still an issue for students. Next, we will highlight the metrics that help paint the picture of the Illinois B through 20 or birth through 20 landscape. We'll explore trends around enrollment, state spending, affordability, and last, mental health. Overall, the population in Illinois has decreased slightly, with more pronounced decreases for school-aged children, with decreases ranging from 10 to 13%. Our K-12 public schools have matched that decrease, which is proportional to the population change. Meanwhile, our post-secondary institutions have seen an outsized decrease of 28%, a 28% decrease, a trend that predated the pandemic. Diversity has risen both generally and across the state. We can see that clearly in the increase in the number of districts that serve English learners across the state, and also the concentration of English learners in some districts increasing. This is also a trend that we are seeing across locales. So we saw a 69% increase in English learners in rural areas, 45% in urban areas, and 34% increase in suburban areas, highlighting the need for the state to better understand how more districts than ever will require supports to ensure these students have access to the necessary supports. Next, we will see how the state has progressed when it comes to state funding. Despite recent efforts to increase funding across the continuum, spending is still inadequate and sometimes inequitable. Looking at state-funded preschools on the left, the state grew its spending by 21% from 2008 to 2024, but we remain right in the middle of the pack at ranked 26th. Meanwhile, in higher education, the state actually cut its spending by 33% during this period, with Illinois being ranked nearly last in the country consistently since 2008. And later on in the presentation, we'll talk about why that matters so much to students and families. So next, we see a very different story for our K through 12 spending. Funding for K-12 schools grew 75% between 2008 and 2024, increasing our ranking from 47th to 18th. Importantly, those funds have gone out more equitably after the passage of the evidence-based funding formula and has reduced the percent of students attending a district that is significantly underfunded from 62% to 4%, a tremendous amount of progress in just a few years. Despite increases in funding, decades of disinvestment have resulted in overly high costs for students and families. For each sector, we will look at the percent of income a family would have to contribute to afford either childcare or tuition and fees. For early childhood, that affordability benchmark set by the federal government is 7%, and we are nearly double that for a median income family and are asking families at the federal poverty line to contribute 41% of their income. Community colleges mirror national averages for affordability at about 5% of a family income for tuition. Meanwhile, our public universities outpace those national averages, requiring median income families to contribute 18% of their income, and a family at the federal poverty line nearly 50% of their income. We are pricing out families and students out of these important services. Next, we'll highlight some of the student wellness trends that we are seeing in both our K-12 sector and higher education. For our K-12 students, we know that 3 out of every 4 Illinois youth have experienced an adverse childhood experience, with Black students being most likely to have 3 or more ACEs. We also know from the K-12 Youth Risk Behavioral Survey that more students than ever are feeling sad or hopeless, and those trends were rising before the pandemic, but were very much exacerbated during that time. These trends are similar for students in higher education. We found that twice as many students felt that their mental health affected their academics when comparing that to 2007, with higher rates for student groups like Latinx students, students with financial stresses, and trans students. As noted earlier, this is one of the federal data sets at risk. The K through 12 Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System was taken down, but a court ordered it to be restored. It currently has a banner on its website rejecting the gender ideology expressed in the data and noting that information may be modified or removed in the future. So just that quick flag there. Now we will discuss each sector, and during these sections, we will highlight key findings related to enrollment and access, learning conditions, and outcomes for each. With changing state demographics, access to our early childhood education and care systems have also shifted. There is still work to do in ensuring that all eligible children have access to childcare. And for example, only 21% of birth to 2-year-olds are being served by the current system. Additionally, enrollment has shifted with more students enrolled in preschool for all and less enrolled at Head Start. Lastly, disinvestment has resulted in large gaps to adequacy, or what the Funding Commission recommends is necessary to support children in these settings to what the state is offering. Gaps range from $10,000 per student to $18,000 per student. This often results in costs being pushed to families. A quality early childhood education is directly tied to its educators and early childhood professionals. And we know that early childhood professionals are not well compensated. Although 69% of early childhood professionals hold an associate's degree or higher, on average, they earn less than an average Illinoisan with an associate's degree, a trend that has remained stable the last 15 years. Looking closer at this, we see that an average associate's degree holder in Illinois makes about $54,000, whereas an early childhood professional makes about $40,000, although they would, on average, have the same educational attainment. We also know that vacancies are on the rise, and they take nearly 4 weeks to fill those positions. And lastly, fewer students are being served in a center with a quality accreditation, decreasing the number of those students being served in that setting from 80,000 in 2016 to 50,000 in 2023. Lastly, as noted earlier, we have seen an increase in the percentage of kindergarteners exhibiting readiness in all 3 domains, so that's math, literacy, and social emotional, and the number of students showing readiness in 0 areas has decreased. This is worth celebration, but we also found that the percentage point gap between English learners, students with IEPs, and students from low-income backgrounds actually grew since 2018 when you compare that to their peers. We know that kindergarten readiness is a strong predictor of future success, so understanding these key equity gaps is critical. Next, we'll explore our K-12 findings. As we noted earlier, enrollment in our K-12 schools has decreased at a similar rate as the population change. Another enrollment trend that is worth noting is the number of students that are neither enrolled in a public school nor a registered private school. Illinois is one of a few states who does not require parents to register their homeschool students, but through our analysis, we're able to estimate that although historically this number was about 1% of students, this has increased to between 3 to 6% of students in the last few years. So an increase in the number of students who are neither enrolled in a public or a private. Quick note on this is also federal data at risk. The census data is used throughout this entire presentation. Understanding education requires accurate data of U.S. residents. The Trump administration's targeting of undocumented immigrants and previous attempts to interfere with the census is putting this data set at risk. As we noted earlier, the progress in our K-12 state spending has been tremendous and is largely due to the state's investment in the evidence-based funding formula. The state passed EBF, or the evidence-based funding formula, in 2017 and has since invested roughly $2.4 billion in this formula. This means that the number of significantly underfunded districts, or districts that have less than 70% of what they need to run their schools, has dropped from 431 districts to 49. And because of this equitable distribution included in the formula, this means that equity gaps have begun to close. We can see this in the per pupil gap to full funding. In 2018, that was around $4,500 for Black and Latinx students, and since that number has dropped to about $3,000 per student in 2025. This is important progress for the state, but there is more work to be done. The largest gaps still exist for Black and Latinx students, students from low-income backgrounds. You can see here for urban students and English learners. So still some gaps that the state is working to address. These increased funds have empowered districts to make important investments in educators. We have seen our gaps in student to teacher ratios nearly close over the last 7 years. You can see this with the dark blue line, which highlights our Tier 1 districts or our most significantly underfunded districts, and how that gap has closed over time. We found a similar trend in seeing that the student to teacher ratios gaps that are closing for both districts that have higher concentrations of students of color and students from low-income households. Overall, we found that the educator workforce grew by nearly 6% since 2016, so really strong investments in this area. Importantly, despite increased diversity in educator prep programs and the educator pipeline broadly, diversity remains stubbornly low, with educators of color making up 18% of the workforce. Meanwhile, students of color make up 54% of our schools. As we are seeking to understand the learning conditions of our K-12 schools, it is important to examine the school climate. Student wellness trends, including chronic absenteeism, are at a historic and worrisome level. Chronic absenteeism is a powerful predictor of future success, and we have seen that dramatically increase since the pandemic. That's nearly 8 percentage points statewide. Just last week, again, ISB released the most recent state report card. What we saw in the most recent data was that chronic absenteeism decreased slightly, about 1 percentage point between the 2 years. So although we're excited to report that number continues to fall since it's high in 2022, it's still at a concerningly high rate. As we noted earlier in this presentation, high school mental health trends are worrisome, trends that have been on the rise prior to the pandemic as well. We found that 26% of Illinois students reported that their mental health was most of the time or always not good. And the percentage of students feeling sad or hopeless increased from 27% in 2009 to 38% in 2023, a significant increase. This highlights the need for resources that can better support the whole child. Thanks to strong and growing EBF funding, we see that districts are able to increase their hiring for more student support personnel, or SSPs. And what we found is that Illinois is ranking 8th in the nation for access to counselors and treatment for students and this youth. We also saw that the ratios of SSPs to students has improved since 2018. So again, those are nurses, our school counselors, our social workers. However, only school psychologists, only one of these, met the recommended benchmarks for these ratios. And so what does that mean for families and students? It means that only 13% of students throughout the state attend a district with sufficient counselors. And we have seen racial gaps increase in this time as well. The changes highlighted in the prior slides have had direct impacts on school culture and climate. Studies show that schools strong in at least 3 of the 5 essentials, including effective leaders, supportive environment, ambitious instruction, are significantly more likely to show strong student growth. And unfortunately, since 2018, the percent of schools with strong or strongest implementation decreased across each of the essentials. Additionally, the percentage of schools strong in at least 3 dropped from 29 to 20%. A trend that is worth exploring more. Next, taking a look at another key indicator of school climate, we found that suspensions and expulsions have decreased significantly since 2014. Although, unfortunately, significant equity gaps remain, with Black students more likely to be suspended than their peers. Next, we're going to explore the nuanced and complicated story of how K-12 students are performing academically. If you haven't had a chance, you can start throwing in some questions. We'll be getting to the question and answer portion in just a moment. To start, and a sobering start at that, is that only about 1/3 of students are demonstrating proficiency in reading and math based on the NAEP, a trend that has remained remarkably stable for the last 15 years. Importantly, increased state rankings in 4th and 8th grade in 2022 suggest that Illinois weathered the pandemic better than most. You can see this by looking at the 2019 ranking and the 2022 ranking. To look closer, Illinois ranked 28th in 2019 and improved to 17th in 2022, despite still having only about 1/3 of students proficient. What that means is that other states likely saw some drop in proficiency during that same time. While grade 4 reading returned Illinois to the middle of the pack in 2024, Illinois remained among the best in the country in grade 8. As statewide proficiency rates remain stable, we are also seeing that long-standing equity gaps in proficiency have started to close, yet they still exist. Looking at English learners, the gap to the statewide average for this group was 31 percentage points in 2011 and decreased to 27 percentage points in 2024. An important improvement with more work to be done. A trend that we saw in Illinois as well as nationally was that struggling students or the students in the lowest 10th percentile have not rebounded from the pandemic at the same rate as higher scoring students or students in the 90th percentile. It's important to understand overall proficiency, but it's also important to understand how our students are growing. Illinois continues to outperform other states in student growth, but our growth is still recovering from the pandemic. You can see this diverging story very clearly in the figure where from 2014 to 2019, Illinois students experienced over 5 years of growth or 5 years of growth in a 5-year period, or the period between 3rd and 8th grade. But unfortunately, that trend has slowed with recent 8th grade cohorts not achieving a full 5 years of growth. This is a trend that was seen nationally, so although Illinois has slowed, Illinois is still ranked 2nd and 3rd nationally in reading and growth, something to be applauded. Lastly, we will highlight some other key indicators of success that have shown positive progress in recent years. Both 9th grade on track and graduation rates remain in the high 80s, with key equity gaps closing. Black and Latinx students and students from low-income backgrounds have had significant growth, as well as English learners, who you can see here, increased graduation rates from 57% in 2008 to 77% in 2024, highlighting the important work that districts and schools have done to support these students. A quick note, we saw both of these metrics slightly increase on the recent report card. And next, we'll go on to our higher education. And we will jump into higher education again, opening an opportunity for questions and answers if people have them. I know we're moving very quickly. Last, we'll dive into higher education, where as we noted earlier, the 28% drop in enrollment at our post-secondary institutions is outsized compared to the 10.4% decrease in young adults during that same period. The pandemic had a real impact on student enrollment, but a trend that we are seeing reversed in enrollment numbers the last few years. At the same time, our post-secondary institutions are becoming more racially and socioeconomically diverse. We can see that in the figure, and if you take a closer look, you can see, for example, Latinx students made up 12% of our institutions in 2008 and have increased to 24% in 2023. Low state investment in higher education has created an affordability crisis. As a reminder, Illinois ranks 48th in the nation for per student spending in higher education, forcing that burden on tuition and fees. Tuition and fees are more affordable at community colleges and are only about $500 more than the national average for public 2 years. But as you can see in the figure on the left, our public universities are prohibitively expensive, around $4,000 more than our national average for tuition and fees. These high costs have increased the average post-secondary debt from $4,800 to $7,600 since 2010. Importantly, net prices, or what students and families actually pay, are significantly lower than tuition and fees. State financial aid and institutional scholarships help bring down the net price. Illinois has increased investments in the state financial aid program, or the monetary award program, by 77% from 2019 to 2025, and have also increased the average award size. This is amazing progress and is making an impact on some of these net price calculations. Yet families still shoulder a significant burden, and those burdens are higher for Black and Latinx families, where we are asking those families to contribute 19% and 13% of their income for the cost of attendance at a public university. Despite the dramatic cuts to state spending, Illinois institutions are spending more on academic and student supports like academic tutoring and wraparound services. These efforts are paying off, with retention rates on the rise. We saw retention rates increase from 71% to 76% during this time. Although institutions do have more to do to ensure they are supporting all students, given that we still see some significant gaps in retention rates among part-time students, Black students, and Latinx students. As we are seeing retention rates increasing, we are also seeing graduation rates rising from 62% to 66%. Yet we continue to see significant equity gaps. We also found that Illinois students that transfer from a community college complete their bachelor's degree at the highest rate in the country. This shows once we get students to a public university, they are likely to succeed. But in the last decade, unfortunately, we have seen the number of students making that transfer drop 32%, a trend that the state needs to take seriously as this pathway is a really important one for students. And last, the state established the goal of having 60% of Illinoisans having a post-secondary credential by 2025. What we found is that the state has made real progress against this goal, with about 49% of Illinois residents have a post-secondary degree and another 8% having a high-quality credential, getting Illinois very close to our 60% goal. Additionally, though, and importantly as we end this presentation, critical equity gaps are closing with Black and Latinx attainment, which increased by 9% since 2010. So we saw significant growth in these areas, but as you can see here in the figure, there's still work to be done to ensure that all Illinois have equal access to a post-secondary education. So I'm going to stop for questions and answers now, and I will let Jason start posing them.
Hi, Kelsey. So we've gotten a couple questions coming in from the audience already. The first question we have for you is from Les Malloy. What impact, if any, did the ISB literacy plan have on our high reading growth score?
That's a great question. One, I think the literacy plan has set a really strong foundation of what high quality literacy looks like and should look like in the state. And I know it's definitely guiding conversations. That report or that literacy plan just recently came out, and I think we're starting to see really strong signs of shifting proficiency and growth. So I think it's a little bit too early to say on whether how directly the literacy plan had an impact, because we did see high areas of growth for our reading and prior to that report of that release.
That's great. Thank you so much. Looks like the second question we have for you here is from Donna Limper. The growth in middle school outcomes suggests that we may need more professional development in K through 5 educators. Do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think one, what we are seeing is really strong growth in our 3rd through 8th grade. So I think it does actually point to once we get our students enrolled, they may be showing up less prepared than others. Again, we see that low kindergarten readiness, or kindergarten readiness, only about a third are coming in kindergarten ready. We see proficiency rates at about 30% for our 3rd graders. So we do know we have kind of an uphill battle when we have our students coming in at those rates. But we are seeing a strong growth during that 3rd through 8th. So I think it actually does point to, there's something happening in our Illinois schools across, and the strong support of educators and students and superintendents across the districts to really focus on that growth, because we do consistently rank high in growth. One thing we did see is definitely some changes since the pandemic on the 5 essentials for middle schoolers, and that's included in the report a little bit more. But our middle school students take a culture and climate based on the 5 essentials did take a bigger hit. So it is worth exploring what's going on in our middle schools a little bit more.
Great, thank you. And then we just got a question in from Erin Roche asking about accountability. So where does accountability fit into the picture across the B through 20 continuum?
That's a great question. And accountability does look very different across the different continuums for early childhood, higher ed, and K through 12. I think largely in early childhood and higher ed, a lot of that has to do with accreditation and overall of those processes. In K-12, we didn't do a deep dive into accountability in this report. It was generally out of the scope of this report, but it's something I think a lot of the metrics we do look at funnel into the accountability system, both the old one and some of the new proposed accountability metrics out there. So 9th grade on track, graduation rates, student growth, all of those do funnel into the accountability system.
Great, thank you. Our next question is going to be from Anonymous, and then we're wondering, how did you standardize the costs within the public universities when flagship universities' costs often significantly outpace many of the regional public institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we do some weighting of enrollment in those areas, knowing that those costs do range. But we were trying to look at statewide what were students experiencing. So a great question, and when disaggregated by regional versus flagship, you do see some differences in costs.
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question here from Marie Donovan. Were all the higher ed data from public institutions only, including the total number of degrees, or was some data sets including private and public institutions data?
Yeah, that's definitely an important question. I think throughout the report where we were looking at just public 4 years or public community colleges, we tried to denote that versus when we did look at all institutions. We do think it's important to look at, many Illinois students go to a private institution in the state. And so there was times when we are looking at that. When we were looking at enrollment numbers, we were looking at all public and community colleges in the state. And so I do think that is all the time we have for questions today. We appreciate you so much, and I will pass it to our Director of Community Engagement, Cheryl Flores.
Hi, Kelsey. Thank you so much for walking us through the data and walking us through how Illinois has grown over the last 15 years and where inequities persist. Now that we have a statewide picture, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists who represent different areas of the education continuum. And I do want to note that while they all have a long list of accomplishments and recognitions, I will not get to share all of that, but you can read through their full bios in the resource folder and encourage you to do so. And I will start by introducing our early childhood education and care voice of the panel, Erin Acosta, director at One Hope United, a longtime early childhood advocate and educator with over a decade of experience in the field. She's also a current doctoral candidate who is focusing on strengthening the early learning workforce. So welcome, Erin. Glad to
Thank you
have
so
you
much.
here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next, we have Representative Carol Ammons, who proudly serves the 103rd District, currently serving her 6th term, a fierce champion for higher education, equity, and accessibility, and also a founding member of the Illinois Progressive Caucus. Welcome, Representative Ammons. And lastly, we have Yesenia Lopez, a Chicago Public School graduate and current school board member for the Chicago Board of Education, a dedicated advocate for equity and leader in working to transform our schools into empowered community hubs. Welcome, Yesenia. And let's dive right in. Again, encourage our audience, if you do have questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A feature in your toolbar, and we'll get to those towards the end. But let's dive right in. And we just heard a lot of information on the state we're in, and really would love to hear from each one of you what trend or finding most stood out to you, and did any of it surprise you? And we'll start with you, Erin.
Thank you so much again for having me today. I think there's a lot of really interesting information in the report. I think the one that stood out to me because it affects me daily is the fact that in early childhood, despite investment, despite direct efforts and compensation, there's turnover is still increasing. That is alarming. It's concerning because we know decades of research have told us how important continuity of care is for the young child. And I consider early learning programs as foundational for the family as it is for the young child. I think we're really risking losing also mentorship from veteran teachers who are preparing the workforce to be sustainable and strong in every stage. So that's what I would say stuck with me the most.
Thanks, Erin. How about you, Representative Ammons?
First of all, thank you all so much for consistently doing the work necessary for lawmakers to try to use this information to make better decisions. I agree with Erin on the early childhood turnover, which is important to us. And I'm very happy about the investments the state has made around the evidence-based funding model. We are not where we should be with that, right? So we want to acknowledge that in order for us to meet our own objectives, we have to continue to invest the money into the EBF. But it has made significant impacts in districts that were really struggling. I appreciate the graph showing what we were before as far as the 3,000, little over 3,000 investment, and to jump that up to almost 9,000 is a significant investment from the state and should be applauded, certainly. But we just haven't made that investment in the higher education space, right? Certainly, we've been working for a number of years now to shift the way that we invest dollars into higher ed to bring down the cost for families, especially since we have an economy that basically requires you to have at least a 4-year degree to work in this economy, right? So it is important. That portion of the report really highlighted that we have so much more that we need to do in the space of higher ed.
Thanks so much. And I know we'll get to higher ed in a little bit. There's more questions for you on that. How about you, Yesenia?
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Advance Illinois, for the opportunity to join this panel with these amazing leaders. I'll say one of the items that stood out the most to me is the real progress made in higher graduation rates, stronger access to early learning, more students enrolling in college, but also realizing that the gains are not necessarily even. The data, shows clear improvement, but also identifying areas for growth, and that it's a reminder for all of us that education does not happen in isolation. It's deeply tied to housing, health, safety, and stability. And it also points out one thing we have to keep saying out loud, and the representative also mentioned this, of the need of sustainable investment in public education, especially in communities that have been carrying the most inequities the longest. In the last 15 years, our country has been hit with a pandemic, and now more recently, primarily in Illinois and Chicago, in the greater Chicago area, been hit with higher federal agents impacting also our students and the type of education they're receiving, given the trauma they're receiving.
Thanks so much for elevating those important notes, Yesenia, and definitely want to follow up in a little bit on some of that. Before that, though, one more question for this group. All of you have been working for years on advancing opportunity for students and families across the state. Can you share a little bit about, as you reflect back on your own work, what specific areas do you think have had the most meaningful impact on students and families? And for this one, we'll start with you, Representative Ammons.
I think that if we recall, I appreciate Yesenia making the point about the immigration impact for students in Chicago and even across the state, right? Making people afraid to seek support and help. But we also saw an increase really as we left from we got COVID, we got George Floyd incident that takes place that spurs the Black Caucus to look at the entirety of the education access system from early childhood to workforce development. And in that legislative package, we come out with several of these initiatives that include attempting to increase the salaries and the resources for early childhood teachers, and at the same time, wanting to invest into the necessary curriculum that would get our students to graduation and success in the workforce. And we've seen this whole entire spectrum grow, but students are saying, they're really feeling a lot of anxiety, their own mental health, their well-being, their sadness, the lack of resources in their personal lives as well as in their school experiences are really weighing on students. Students should not have to worry about where they're going to get their meal from and then go to school, right? So we have all of these societal issues that well-being of the human being sometimes get lost in our stats and numbers and graphs. But these are real people who are reporting that they're struggling with mental health. And so for us, certainly in the higher education space, we've also sent additional resources for mental health services on campuses across the state. We've tried to fill in the gaps where we see them. Unfortunately, in the current moment, the Trump administration, which is a whole nother calamity against higher education and public education, is causing additional stressors on our families right now that is going to require all of us to really come together and reimagine what it should be. We have gaps that your graphs have shown us that are still based on race, that are still based on economics and zip codes, that we must actually not only face up to, but make the policy changes necessary to truly close the gaps. Every single year, we should not say, well, we got gaps, but, at some point, gaps have to be closed. And I think that this kind of form, this kind of report helps us to put that into a realistic paradigm so that we can really see it. And then for us to be honest as lawmakers as how we actually fix it, if that is indeed the goal. That I think is what is necessary.
Thanks so much, Representative. And again, more to follow up there on everything you just shared. Erin, how about you?
Sure. I think one of the things that the report showed was an increase in, well, I think first of all, it showed how the cost of the cost of early learning is such a burden on families. It's really something that is a challenge for most families that you ask. So to see that also in the report, preschool for all expansion has increased, I think that was a really meaningful step towards providing access for many, many families to have that consistent and at an early age, so that early learning programs can serve their full purpose of being not just for academics, but a hub of resources and support for the entire family as well as the child.
Thanks, Erin. And how about you, Yesenia?
In my end, I'll say the most meaningful change has been centering students and family voice. When our policies are shaped with communities, not for them, but seen it as they are part of the solution. We've seen already the gains and the impact on this. We've expanded bilingual and newcomer support, grown our community schools, and focus on equity-based funding. Make sure every student has access to supports they deserve, not just the basics. And that's what it looks like when we treat families as partners in learning, not just as participants in this system, especially with Chicago Public Schools, that we're one of the largest school systems in the country, and also leveraging the partnerships that we have across the state, for example, with Advanced Illinois, with our state legislators, locally with our city councils. Then we are reimagining what public education looks like moving into the 24th century and forward.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful perspective, Yesenia. Now I'm going to move us along to specific issue area questions. So again, we have panelists who represent each of those issue areas, and I'm going to start with our early childhood education and care questions for you, Erin. The report highlighted that wages are increasing for early childhood educators, but compensation still lags behind compared to other professions, and turnover is also something to worry about in the field. What policies come to mind that would help address both pay and retention in the field?
Sure. I think that's compensation is at the top of every early childhood educator's mind. We recognize that it is such a significant challenge, but it's not the only challenge. And I think even within the under the umbrella of compensation, there's things like benefits, aligned retirement and health plans that are not always a guarantee for, especially folks who work in center-based programs that are not attached to a school district like myself. I think, that also when we talk about retention, we're also thinking about recruitment as well, sustaining the workforce and making sure that it's healthy and full of talent and development opportunities. And I think that's another area that we can think about as well. Opportunities for professional and growth and education. That's very personal to me. I'm standing here only because I'm the grateful recipient of the ECA scholarship that opened so many doors for me. To put it in perspective, I started my college degree, my bachelor's degree in the year 2000, and I finally finished in 2023. And it was only because ECAs gave me that push to finish. And I think that story is my own. But it's not unique. I'm one of many in the field who share that experience. ECA still exists, but it's just sort of a fraction of what it once was. And nothing really has risen to take its place to support educators who are ready to make that move and take those next steps to enhance the quality of the work that they're already doing. So in terms of, an alternative scholarship program, even loan forgiveness, which was once an option, is no longer really on the table. Those are all things that I think would attract and retain high quality educators.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you for sharing your story. We know how critical the ECA scholarship is for the state, and it's great to hear that you were a recipient of that. And a lot of the thoughts that you shared, I'm sure that the new agency, right, the Illinois Department of Early Childhood is thinking and hard about. And with it, it's new data integrated system. And if you can share a little bit about how you believe better data will lead to, improvements around planning, addressing equity issues, and accountability in the field.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot that can be done with data, especially when it's used through a curious lens and not to sort of have like gotcha moments for certain demographics or certain regions or areas. I think that, of course, it can help identify priority populations, those preschool deserts where those may exist, and look for any patterns of what might be causing that, but also looking for patterns of where things are being successful and what strategies have contributed to that success. I think a lot about in the report you touched on ACEs scores. I think that's valuable information, not just for adults, families, but for the educators as well. How is that affecting the practice that they do every day, directly caring for young children and being a support for your young families? I think those are all really meaningful things. I also, when we think about the link to kindergarten readiness, the absenteeism, I'm wondering if there's any information that can be revealed about how many students and families are struggling to have their basic needs met. I think that would be something that would be a priority support, in the IDEC information could really help identify that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. And I'm hearing a common theme, right? It's not only looking at education in silo, but really about these other systems that we know our families interact with on a daily basis and are critical to their success. So appreciate your thoughtful perspective. I'm going to move us along to K-12. So Yesenia, part of the report highlighted that chronic absenteeism rates are still of concern. And I know you touched on this a little bit in one of your first answers, but given the shifts that are currently happening, including federal enforcement activity, how is that shaping how districts are trying to address the chronic absenteeism rates? And also, what paths do you see that do exist to help re-engage families and students?
Thank you, Sharon, for the question. We know that rise in absenteeism, it has been deeply concerning over on the district. We've seen with Chicago having one of the highest one. The strategic plan, 5-year plan that was passed in the last year or so, that's one of the items we intend to address, and the goal is to cut it at least by half of the percentage. We also understand that it's pretty much an impact in understanding the root causes of it, which is a combination of the lingering pandemic disruptions, health issues, housing instability, safety concerns, including bullying, immigration related fear, and economic hardship. In Chicago, we see this firsthand, as I mentioned. So we are thinking about how do we re-engage the student and the family as a whole, and how do we partner up with whether it be nonprofits, but starting at the home with home visits, re-engagement specialists, trusted community partners that already have those relationships with the parents. For example, the promotoras, expanding our community sustainable school model that are able to provide wraparound services for the student. And also programs that make it a place where a student wants to be in and be in community. So scaling that statewide, of course, we know that it means investment, whether it be from local entities and also thinking of creative ways of partnership with philanthropy, giving schools and communities flexibility to meet families where they are. And this was mentioned before by another panelist, right? Data is important, but oftentimes you also gotta analyze of what is causing for that data in, the root cause of what is it showing us of students not going to school. Right now, what we're seeing, at least as it pertains to the Chicago public schools, is that we've seen a drop in 1.5% of attendance. And a lot of it does have to do with the fear of the increase of federal agents. So how do we meet those families, in the middle? How do we work with them? Something that we've been hearing from families is wanting an option for remote learning. It is a very complex decision to come to as a district, and also a lot of it we got to work with ISB on this. But how do lessons learned from the COVID pandemic? How do we even roll out remote learning in a way that is equitable? Thinking of do our families have access to stable Wi-Fi, to technology? Our students with special education, how can we make sure they are receiving the minutes that they need, and also our English learner? So it's something that right now, in this moment, as a district, we continue having these conversations, not just here locally in Chicago, but also with other communities like Elgin, Waukegan, who have been impacted.
Thank you, Yesenia, and I appreciate all the work you're doing along with others to address this immediate concern for not only Chicago, but really other communities as well. And just highlighting how complex it is, right? And the partnerships that need to be in place as well. I'm going to shift us a little bit for the next question, Yesenia, still related to K-12, but this around the NAEP scores, right? I think Kelsey's presentation shared it's a complicated story when we look at Illinois. While we've weathered better than other states, scores still remain relatively flat. But Chicago, on the other hand, has increased in its proficiency rate for 8th grade math to its pre-pandemic high. Additionally, it's also demonstrated growth in the share of 8th graders proficient in reading. Can you share a little bit about what's driving that recovery in Chicago public schools and how the state can help sustain it?
One of the main items was the increase in funding that the district received during COVID from the federal government that allowed for more programs in hiring of individuals in whether it be the classrooms in a school setting. So we were able to, see those gains. Now the question is, how do we maintain and increase those gains when that funding has dried up? And it was an important question that board members were asking ourselves more recently in August as we were looking at a budget with a gap of $734 million. And we passed this budget addressing that gap, ensuring that we were not cutting any positions within the classroom or the schools that would directly impact students, right? So a lot of it now is how do we ensure that we keep those systems that we put in place, but it does require funding. The other item that we've seen in your data show, right, was with the English learner students, that we've seen that the numbers where they're able to learn quicker and faster, and they're roughly about 27.3% of our students that are English learners. So how do we continue also investing in those communities, which is not just Spanish speakers. We have from Mandarin to other large languages, especially coming in. Board Member Smith from the Board of Education in Chicago often reminds us, in the south side of Chicago, we also have a large growing immigrant population from Africa. So how do we continue also addressing their needs and continue keeping up the data and the gains we've made in the last few years?
Thank you so much, Yesenia, for your thoughtful responses, and also elevating state investment, right, is a critical part of all of this. And I think that's a nice segue for our next set of questions to our Representative Ammons here. You've been a longtime champion on higher education equity and access issues for the state. And as you saw in the report, college affordability and access remain a barrier for many Illinois families, especially our Black household families and households from low-income backgrounds. Outside of investing in MAP, Representative Ammons, what structural solutions are there to address college affordability and access for all, especially when we think about those families at or below the federal poverty level?
I think one of your charts highlighted the success of community colleges in our state. I think that's a very good point that we should start at, looking at ways to make sure that community college is not just accessible, but affordable. And some states have already beat us to the free or tuition-free community college model, which I advocate for and continue to advocate for, because community college is the first step that people, certainly returning adult learners, utilize. But a lot of high school students, as your other chart showed, are going directly to their local community college. And if they go there, the success tells us from your chart that the likelihood of them going on to matriculate to the four-year institution is that much better, and the graduation rate is that much better when they are able to access their community college. But our state has to, we have to come to terms with how we actually fund higher education. The flat model funding that we've been doing for a very long time, since the 50s, it doesn't work. It just doesn't provide enough resources to some of our institutions that are the regional institutions. And I believe there was a question about the difference in how we determine the median cost of attendance. When you look at that, we have to put more money into that system. There's just no way for us to get around that. But we also have to make the decision when we put additional resources in that we have to distribute those resources equitably or based on the needs of those institutions that we're trying to support. And I think that will help us bring down the cost of tuition and make more access to students who really want to go. Students have said that, yeah, I don't know if I'm going because it costs too much. That is number one in every single survey that I've ever seen about why a person decides to go or not go. But it also allows our institutions to invest in those critical resource needs that they need for their students, based on the population of the students that they serve. And so some of our institutions can increase that retention rate and allow for students to have academic supports, and others are struggling to provide the basic need supports at those institutions. I think that's an unequal and unlevel playing field. And if we want to really address access points for higher education, we're going to have to do that by equitable distribution. We also saw that Black and Brown student rate retentions in our state are okay, right? But do we want to be okay or we want to be great? right? We have to decide what we want to be and then develop the models around that so the retention rate can be up higher and the graduation rate can meet the needs of our economy, which we currently don't do. And that's important that Black and Brown students are part of that economy because we are a part of the state's overall economy, but we have to have the same access to education as other communities may have. And you and I and some of our wonderful education leaders, advocacy organizations have really focused on that dual credit pathway, which again, I'm one of those persons that tell the high schooler, no, you're going to do dual credit, you know, not optional. You're going to do dual credit because we already know that that is going to save you time and it's also going to save your family money. So this again, we really have to make sure that families understand that there are many ways to get through, right, college, and every person's path is different. As Erin shared, her path is different than other people's paths may be, but it doesn't mean that there's not a path for you. That dual credit is a huge advantage in our state, and we did expand that in the 2021 package that was passed by the Black Caucus and the General Assembly. And then I believe that if we help high school students increase that enrollment in that dual credit, we will see our overall enrollment in higher education increase, but we will see that graduation rate increase as well, because those students are investing at the front end and their families are saying, hey, you know, maybe we can actually afford for you to continue on. And that gives them a little bit of hope, I believe is necessary in all of those areas for us to redress them.
Thank you so much, Representative Ammons. And I, for one, want us to be great, right?
I think so. I think so. We should be great.
But I think throughout everyone's answers in some way or another, we spoke about state investment, right? The report highlights that the state has made critical investments across the education continuum. But I think we all would love to hear from you, Representative Ammons. We know that Illinois is in a particularly difficult financial situation, right? Facing budget deficits. I think especially right now with everything happening at the federal level, there's a lot of uncertainty. We already know of cuts happening across, in education and outside of education. And so would love to hear a little bit about what is the likelihood that the state can and will continue to stay the course on key education investments from early childhood to post-secondary?
Well, I think that certainly the people of Illinois should be pleased to know that there are so many education advocates in the General Assembly. Many of us are insistent in every conversation. And this, I don't even necessarily believe is just a Democrat or Republican issue. I think all of us across the spectrum want to see a strong educational landscape for Illinois. The cuts in our federal resources, though, make that difficult, as people know. But it doesn't change, in my estimation, the desire of our members. Right? Our members' desire is to make sure that we are successfully investing in early childhood all the way to workforce development, because states are going to have to figure out how to reimagine a more well-being economy that meets the needs of the people. And unfortunately, may not necessarily allow us to track our dollars into some of these wonderful corporate investments that we do, but don't have the same rate of return that we know we get when we really invest our dollars in higher education. For instance, the rate of return is 19-1. So I don't understand if people are concerned about the state's fiscal house right now. I believe 100% that we cannot walk back our investments in education. If there's any way for us to do that, we have to remain committed to investing adequate dollars and resources, because we are behind. We're not ahead, we're behind in our investment in early childhood. We know that we're behind in our investment in higher education, trying to make up for many, many years of disinvestment in those spaces. And so now I believe that when we're in a challenged fiscal condition, that we have to prioritize health and wellness and the needs of the greater residents of the state of Illinois, which means that we have to invest in healthcare, we have to invest in education, we have to invest in housing, and we have to invest in food security.
Thank you so much for that, Representative Ammons. And, you know, it was such a rich discussion. I know we have one audience question, and I do want to be respectful of our time. So, Yesenia, I think this one is for you. And if you can be brief, I apologize. What are schools doing to encourage students not to give up, since the immigration situations impact tremendously our communities? Could you, that came from one of our audience members, if you have brief thoughts on that.
No, thank you. At the district level in Chicago, one in our website, we put already a page of different resources for families, including from quick Know Your Rights workshops coming up. Also, a list if their family members detained, call the hotline, ICER. But also, we are working with the protocols that have been sent to each school, working with the principal and also their counseling team members. So whenever there's a student impacted, they're working directly with them, but also having a space for the rest of the student body. Some of the principals, and it's more at every school, it's depending on their leadership. What I've seen in this primarily in some of the high schools where they've been impacted greatly, where they've had 20 families already impacted because a parent was detained, is there's day of action either indoors, or one of them, which got some media attention, was outdoors, where we had about 300 students that walk out. But others that are indoor is for them to express themselves, whether it be through doing banners, through writing letters to their elected officials, through meditation, and also social emotional support for them. I will say our Department of Family and Community Engagement has stepped up and being able to partner up with our local organizations to provide, whether it be information or also resources like food pantries to our families. What I believe that it's something that needs to be in a larger conversation is how are we supporting the school districts outside of Chicago that might not have those infrastructures in place, like I mentioned with Keegan, Elgin, or suburban areas, among others.
Thanks so much for that, Yesenia. And again, highlighting that this is not a Chicago-only challenge that we're facing. It is happening across the state. So thank you for elevating that. I really wish we had more time to continue. I know there's a lot of follow-up questions that I wish I could have asked for each and every one of you, but thank you for spending time with us this afternoon to share your experience and thoughts on these important issues. And we look forward to working alongside you as well as we move forward.